Given the dramatic nature of the transgender question and the speed at which it seems to have carried all before it, many people wonder, how did we get here? What are the steps that society took in order to make the statement, I'm a man trapped in a woman's body, or I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, coherent? Well, the answer to that is in many ways complicated. There's a complex narrative behind it, but you can break it down into some fairly simple elements. Little thought experiments. Imagine going to the doctor 100 years ago and saying to the doctor, I think I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. The doctor would almost certainly respond to you 100 years ago by saying, well, that's a problem. It's a problem with your mind. We need to address your mind and bring it into conformity with your body. If you were to go to the doctor today and say, I think I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, your doctor will say to you, that's a problem. It's a problem of the body, and we need to bring your body into line with your mind. Now, if you compare those two scenarios, it gives you a big clue as to what has gone on, what lies behind the transgender issue, and it's this. We have come to grant an authority to inner feelings. We have come to grant a power to inner feelings in Western society that was previously unknown to earlier generations. So if we set the question up as, how is it we've come to grant our inner feelings so much power? If we step aside from the specific trans question and ask that question, why do our feelings have such a decisive say in who we are? Then I think we can start to move towards a more historically grounded answer. The answer really is that over the last 300 or 400 years, human beings have become increasingly preoccupied with our inner space. We could point to certain thinkers who've been very influential in this. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the 18th century Genevan philosopher. Sigmund Freud, the late 19th, early 20th psychoanalyst. Friedrich Nietzsche, 19th century German philosopher. Simone de Beauvoir, 20th century feminist thinker. All of them played their role in helping to authorize, strengthen, give power to our inner feelings. But the bottom line is, all of those figures are also part of a more general cultural trend that has granted more and more power to our inner feelings, to the point now where when somebody comes to you and says, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, that sounds plausible to us because we're so used to thinking of our own identity and other people's identity in terms of that inner space. The question of what lies as the essence of the modern self requires a little bit of parsing. First of all, of course, we need to be clear about what we mean by the self. There's a common sense way of using self where I know that I'm me and my wife is another human being, my students are others. I don't confuse myself with my wife or my mother or my students. I have a basic sense of what we might call self-consciousness. An understanding of myself as an individual thinking being. That's one use of the term self. I want to use the term self, though, in a more technical way when I'm thinking about issues like transgenderism and the modern self as a general concept. I want to use the term there to refer to what is it that makes us tick? What is it that makes me me? What is it that shapes the way I imagine my relationship to the world to be? How do I conceive of human flourishing? Perhaps most pointedly, how do I conceive of human happiness and satisfaction? Again, an example to use that brings this out rather nicely. If I were to say to my grandfather, if my grandfather was still alive, did you get job satisfaction? Well, a few things to know about my grandfather. He left school at 13 or 14. He worked in a factory for over 50 years. He was a sheet metal worker. He did what I would regard as very boring, repetitive, physical labor. If I asked him if he got job satisfaction from that, first, I don't think he would actually understand the question. It would not be something he'd ever wrestled with. Secondly, if I explained to him, did you find your job worthwhile? Did it bring you happiness? I think he would answer yes. Yes, not because it was intrinsically interesting or easy. It was hard, monotonous work. But it brought him happiness because he earned a fair day's wage for an honest day's work, and that money met the obligations he had to others. He was able to put food on the table for his family, shoes on his children's feet. You think about that, but the self of my grandfather, we might say, is a very outwardly directed one. My grandfather's sense of purpose and happiness was related to other people. It was outwardly directed. If you ask me if I get job satisfaction, I'm going to answer something along the lines of, yeah, I get a great feeling of contentment when I stand up in front of a class and teach. I find it a psychological buzz when students suddenly grasp a complicated idea that I've been explaining to them for a couple of weeks. Notice my answer. My answer is all about my inner psychological feeling. It's direct and it's psychological. Whereas for my grandfather, it was more to do with meeting his obligations to others. So we might bring this all around and say, so what is the difference between the old self and the new self? I would say the old self finds its purpose in its external relations to others, in fulfilling obligations towards others. The new self finds its happiness and meaning inside through fulfilling obligations to myself. The ethical implications of this notion of the self are quite interesting. One, it can tilt us all intuitively towards seeing other people as potentially adversarial or potential problems or merely instruments for making us happy. When you think about the logic, say, of no-fault divorce, the logic of no-fault divorce is the marriage is valid and should continue for just as long as the two partners find their partner to enhance their happiness. Once the partner ceases to enhance their happiness, there's no problem in the marriage being dissolved. So one of the general social ethical implications of this is it tends to make us literally rather selfish in the way we think about ourselves. Another implication is it will tilt us away from treating all other human beings as equal. We will tend not to see other human beings as all made in the image of God and as all having dignity and all being treated with dignity because of our common humanity. And we'll tend to start thinking of human beings in terms of their specific identities. And so certain identities will be granted dignity and certain identities will be denied dignity, because in this sort of way of thinking, the least important thing about us is our human nature. The key thing is about how we manifest our selfhood. And some selves get favored and some selves don't. You can draw an interesting contrast here, say, with the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s and contemporary manifestations of civil rights. When you read the writings of, say, Martin Luther King, one of the things that Dr. King constantly stresses is all human beings have dignity, that the person of color should be treated the same as the white person because we share a common humanity, and the dignity according to one should be accorded to the other. Civil rights discussion now often focuses around the dignity of particular communities. We don't treat that person with dignity because they're a human being. We treat them because they belong to a particular community to which we grant dignity and authority. So the ethical implications of this are rather interesting and have led to a transformational thing of the way we think about each other within society. We tend to think more about each other in terms of bespoke identities rather than a shared common humanity. When you compare modern notions of selfhood, the bespoke, personal, subjective selfhood that we have today, with what Paul teaches, for example, in the New Testament, or indeed the overall thrust of the biblical storyline, a big difference emerges. The Bible sees all human beings as made in the image of God, and that means all human beings have equal dignity, regardless of one's politics, regardless of one's behavior, regardless of one's sexual orientation, regardless of one's nationality, regardless of one's skin color. We are all joined together by this basic common humanity. We are made in the image of God, and that gives us all a universal dignity, not connected to our nationality or our sexuality, but connected to our humanity. This plays out in two ways, I think, for Christians, particularly Christians involved in engaging with other people, engaging in a pastoral context, youth workers, etc., etc. First of all, we need to remember as Christians that every human being we meet, regardless of their convictions, regardless of their behavior, regardless of their lifestyle choices, regardless of their attitude to us, is worthy of respect, care, and love precisely because they're made in the image of God. So that's a foundational point, I think, for pastoral care. Every human being is made in the image of God, and that is to shape how we treat them, regardless of what other opinions we may have about choices they have made. Secondly, it's a reminder that we must therefore relativize all other identities. So that can be done in a fairly harmless way. I'm English. I've worshipped with Americans for 20 years. It's great when I go to church and I'm not treated any differently because I'm English than the other people in the congregation. My English identity in some ways counts for nothing in the context of the church. Even though I'll always be English and I'll always have that identity, it is relativized compared to the common humanity I have with other Christian believers. In a more pointed way, though, I think it touches on how we would address individuals coming to us who have latched on to identities that perhaps run up against what we would see as central elements of the gospel. The person who's decided that they're gay and wants to pursue a gay lifestyle, or the person who is confused about their gender, the teenager who has decided that though they have the body of a girl, they're really a man, or they have the body of a boy, they're really a girl. I think we need to remember that foundationally, they're made in the image of God. And all of these other identities are to some extent constructed and to be relativized within the broader context of what I would regard as a proper biblical understanding of what it means to be a human being. When you have a good grasp of the idea that human beings are all made in the image of God, it opens the way for tolerance in some ways. That there are many identities out there in the modern world that Christians may disagree with, but they're not harming anybody in particular. We can tolerate them because these are identities being advocated or possessed by fellow human beings made in the image of God. We can relativize those identities in terms of that. Part of the problem, of course, is that tolerance is no longer enough. When you think about tolerance, tolerance means I won't act against you because of this particular thing, but I still profoundly disagree with a decision you're making or an identity to which you are laying claim. Problem in modern society is that that's not enough. People want to belong, they want to be recognized, they want to have people affirm them as who they feel they are. And so the Christian affirmation of all human beings made in the image of God is non-negotiable for us. It's absolutely essential. But we should not expect that it's going to buy us significant cultural or political space. Because the game is not about whether I will tolerate somebody's identity. The question today is about whether I will affirm, recognize, even celebrate that identity. And that's where it becomes problematic for a Christian. A Christian can affirm the common humanity that he or she shares with a gay person or a transgender person. A Christian cannot celebrate the way of life that has been chosen by people who belong to that group. And that's where the problem is going to lie, both nationally, politically for us, but also in our local communities. When you're dealing with kids in your youth group, when you're dealing with people in your church or dealing with your neighbors, it's our inability to recognize and celebrate these identities that's going to land us in trouble. The question of how we love our gay neighbors or how we love the transgender teen, given Christian convictions, is a tricky one. Obviously, every situation has its unique points, so it's very difficult to produce a one-size-fits-all response to this. But I would say a couple of things need to be borne in mind. One, there are certain things that Christians can simply not give ground upon. Sexual behavior is one of them. The created distinction between men and women is another. These are two things that that we have to get right and have to be foundational to whatever pastoral strategy we then employ. We have to be kind and loving with those who are struggling with these things, but we have to do that against the background of the truth. It is not kind and loving to compromise the truth. That can only lead to disaster. So first of all, we have to be clear on biblical sexual mores, biblical notions of identity, biblical notions of the importance of biological sex. Having said that, I think we then need to understand a couple of things in our strategy. One, everybody wants to flourish. Everybody wants to do well. And so as we address the individuals who are struggling with these particular issues, one strategy is to ask the Socratic question. Does this lifestyle choice that you're making, does it lead to flourishing? And then, for example, we can go to some hard scientific data. On the transgender question, for example, suicide rates are catastrophically high even for those who've transitioned. To which the response might be, yes, well, that's because society still isn't affirming of those who've transitioned. Well, this is where a country like Sweden becomes interesting, because Sweden is incredibly affirming of trans people, and yet the suicide rates for those who've transitioned is pretty much the same. So one strategy can be, okay, all human beings want to flourish. I want you to flourish. I want you to be who you really are. I want you to be who God wants you to be. Now let's see how your conviction of who you are connects to evidence for what actually constitutes human flourishing. I was recently chatting to a youth worker who was telling me that in his local school district, 80% of the young girls there now identify as lesbian or bisexual. And we're talking middle school kids here. We're not talking 17, 18, 19-year-olds. We're talking 11, 12, 13-year-olds. 80% of them identify as lesbian or bisexual. Question is, has this always been the case? Have we always had this vast number of lesbian, gay, bisexual people who've just had to stay under the radar because they would get into trouble if they came out? I suspect the answer is no. What we're actually seeing now is the unfortunate harvest that comes from denying children an understanding of friendship that isn't at core profoundly sexual. 30, 40 years ago, kids had friendships. I had friendships when I was at school. I had friendships with other guys, sometimes powerful friendships, pungent friendships, but I never conceptualized them in a sexual way because I had this category of friendship that allowed me to understand how I might relate to another human being without it being at core a sexual relationship or a sexual desire. I think what we've done in modern society is we've forgotten friendship. We now sexualize our kids so early in school. We're teaching them sex education from kindergarten. We have so sexualized the world for our kids that they are incapable of understanding friendship, desire, companionship in any way that doesn't track back to some kind of sexual identity. And what we need to do, what the church needs to do, what youth leaders need to do, what parents need to do, is help their children understand friendship in the traditional sense of the word. We can do that by teaching. We can also do that by the environments we create and the examples we set. And that's where groups like Awana can really come in and help, because they can provide kids context where they can learn to be friends. They can learn this concept of friendship that I think has been debased, if not abandoned, in our society. One of the interesting things about modern society, of course, is that we have quietly but decisively shifted moral language from right and wrong to tasteful and distasteful, or hurtful and affirming. Sometimes we use language of right and wrong, but often we use it in a way that refers to whether somebody's been hurt by a comment or not. It's important, I think, for Christians to make a clear distinction between what is true and what is hurtful. Now, as Christians, we should never gratuitously hurt people. We should never present the truth in a hurtful manner by intention. But we should also not lose sight of the fact that sometimes the truth is hurtful. I joke with my students at Grove that the statement, Trueman is a bald guy with crooked teeth, is hurtful and offensive, but it's nonetheless true. And in the realm of morality today, yes, to tell somebody that their choice of identity or their choice of sexual lifestyle is wrong may well be hurtful, particularly if it goes to the core of who they feel they are. And yet, it may still be the truth. And it may still be necessary to speak that in order to stop that person traveling down a very, very destructive path. Any Christian, how should a youth leader, how should a pastor, how should a parent, how should a grandparent address a young child that they love who, for example, is struggling with gender dysphoria? How do you address that issue? Well, I think a couple of things come to mind. One, I think if you don't have a prior relationship with the child, it's far more difficult. So if you have an established relationship with the child that's a loving one and the child knows that you love and care for them, you've got something to work with. Secondly, I'd want to say, do not trivialize what the child is saying to you. The fact that gender dysphoria, I think, is a relatively new phenomenon in the way it's presenting itself, that there are historical reasons as to why it's emerged here and now, does not mean that it isn't powerful. Think of a cell phone. If you take a cell phone off a teenager, they genuinely feel agony and frustration. I didn't even have a cell phone when I was a teenager. They didn't exist. That desire did not exist. Society has created that desire, but because it's created that desire doesn't mean that it isn't real and powerful. So I think the second thing one needs to do is listen to the child. Listen sympathetically to what the child says and understand that you're listening to what is probably an agonizing and confusing testimony. Thirdly, I think I'd want to ask the child, where do these feelings come from? Tell me the story as to where these feelings come from. I remember talking to one young person who was struggling with gender dysphoria, and I said to him, when did you start to think you were a woman trapped in a man's body? And he said to me, well, I was at school and I was bullied at school. I was kind of geeky. The boys bullied me and the girls allowed me to play their games. And I said to him, you wanted to belong, didn't you? And for him, it wasn't that he was a woman trapped in a man's body. It was he wanted to belong. And the only people who'd ever allowed him to belong were the girls in the schoolyard. So I'm not saying that story applies to every gender dysphoric testimony everywhere, but try to find out why the child thinks the way they do. And then I would say, make sure that the child is not going to do anything that they will regret in later life. I want to say, it's okay for a 9-year-old to be confused. It's okay for a 9-year-old to be confused about gender, in a sense, as long as they make no catastrophic decision that really forecloses the issue. So I would want to say to the person talking to the young child for whom they love and care who's struggling with this, listen, be sympathetic, be supportive of them as a person, discourage them from doing anything dramatic, and try to show them the love of Christ in the way that you engage with them. And allow them to be confused. I was a confused kid. My confusions were in other areas. But it's okay to be a confused young person. Your task as an adult is to help them gently but firmly make their way through that confusion to solid ground. The question posed by many of the sort of sexual revolutionary questions we're now facing as to whether society will ever reverse, or indeed whether society can survive the changes that we're seeing around us. These are interesting questions. On the reversal question, I think we probably need to distinguish between different elements of the LGBTQ rainbow. I think that, for example, gay marriage may well be with us forever and a day. Because there's a sense in which if my neighbors are two guys living together who are married, that doesn't directly impinge upon me. One might say that the only people they're primarily hurting are themselves in that situation. The T, I think, is different. The T is different for a number of reasons, but one of them is this. The T is encroaching on childhood in ways that the L, the G, and the B typically haven't done. Think about it. A girl could claim to be a lesbian at 9, and at 15 she decides she was wrong. She may have made some harmful choices in the interim. She may have some painful memories and relationships to think of, but no permanent damage has been done. If a girl at 9 decides she's a boy trapped in a girl's body and undergoes surgery and undergoes hormone therapy, then her body has been permanently changed. She has cut off the option of ever having children, for example, in her mature adult life. And I think, one, that's a tragedy. Two, I think it's going to lead to lawsuits. I think we're already seeing people transitioning back from having transitioned. In future years, when you get kids whose transition was enabled when they were 9 or 10, and their bodies were permanently damaged, they're going to sue. The question, of course, of what can we do to prevent this damage in our churches is a pressing one. And I think there are some obvious things. Teach the whole counsel of God. I don't think the church should get so preoccupied with the things that pop up in our culture that all we're doing is playing whack-a-mole with cultural issues all the time. If you teach by precept and example the biblical view of marriage, you don't have to be refuting all of the false alternatives all the time. If your kids grow up knowing what true biblical marriage is, they will spot the counterfeits when they cross their path. We don't have to worry too much about trying to second guess the culture in terms of what madness it's going to indulge in next. Teach the whole counsel of God. Give our kids a good framework for addressing whatever the culture throws at them. Secondly, I think we need to think about worship. So much of what we're wrestling with today regarding LGBTQ kind of stuff has not come about as a result of arguments. Our kids are not falling for this stuff because they've read great tomes of gender theory and been persuaded by them. Their imaginations have been gripped by soap operas, by sitcoms, by stories they've read, by TikTok videos they've seen, by YouTube videos they've seen, by testimonies they've heard. Their imaginations have been gripped. Well, the church needs to grip the imagination of its people as well. We do that partly through great fine preaching. We do it partly through the signs and symbols of the faith, baptism and the Lord's Supper. We also do it through worship that speaks to our souls, that grips the imagination. So we need to think about worship as a way of doing that. Thirdly, we need to take our own teaching seriously, and that can be hard. We need to engage in church discipline when people fall outside of the lines. One of the worst mistakes the church ever made was not taking no-fault divorce seriously. That sent the signal that we didn't take marriage seriously. We need to start taking our own teaching seriously and making the painful decisions that may well bring in its wake in certain circumstances. And then I think parents. Parents need to be aware of a number of things. One, they should not assume that the church can carry the spiritual burden for them. They need to be teaching their kids. Secondly, parents need to be aware that it doesn't matter if they send their kids to Christian school or home schools. Teachers are not the most influential people in young people's lives anymore. It's TikTok videos, it's YouTube, it's things like that. And I would say that means do not give your kids a smartphone and do not allow them screen time in private. If you give your kid a smartphone, you're essentially handing the education of your kids over to the most extreme and crazy voices on TikTok and YouTube that you can possibly imagine. So I think parents too need to take real responsibility. That's going to be hard. That's going to put parents at odds with their kids on many occasions. Bottom line is, parents are meant to be parents, not friends of their children. The question of how we should live in our current climate is an interesting one and has numerous aspects. It's impossible to deal with adequately in a short video or a short answer. But I would say there are some things that we need to bear in mind as Christians. One, we always need to do the right thing. We need to live faithfully and do the right thing. That will come with a cost. It certainly looks the case in the West today that that's going to come with an increasingly painful cost. But we need to do the right thing. Secondly, we need to realize that when we do the right thing, not everybody's going to thank us for us. In fact, many people are not going to thank us for us. It may well put us at odds with friends and loved ones and family, but we have to do the right thing. And it points us to the importance of church and community, because when we take stands that leave us isolated in the workplace or in our local community, we all need a place to go where we can find validation and support. We need the church to be a strong community so that we can all stand together on these issues. The church needs to be a place we can go, and to use the sort of contemporary jargon, the church needs to be a safe place for us. It needs to be a place where we can go and be encouraged that we have done the right thing, even though it may have cost us rather badly. Thirdly, we need to focus on the things of eternity. If we just focus on what's going to be happening next week, it's a very bleak picture at this point. We need to remember Paul, 2 Corinthians, which is his great letter of present agonies in this age. And yet he's able to declare there that all that he's suffering is but a light momentary affliction compared to the eternal weight of glory that is to come. He was able to do that because he had a good grasp of the eternal weight of glory that is to come. We need to be in church on a Sunday. We need to be being reminded continually about the eternal weight of glory that is to come. And that also leads, I think, to a change in mindset. One of the things that characterizes the modern mind is we like everything to be instant, partly because most of the people we know think this life is all that we've got. They want everything to happen in this life. They want everything to be happening now. We don't want to save for things. We want to use our credit cards. We don't want to wait to go on holiday. We want to go on holiday now. We want instant gratification. And that bleeds over into the church. We all live in that world. We're all shaped by that. And it can even shape our attitude to good things. That when we think about, well, we want society to be better, we want society to be a place where kids are safe from people imposing freakish gender ideologies upon them and mutilating their bodies. We want society to be a good place for everybody to live, but we need to realize the depth of the problem is such that we're not going to achieve that next week. We're not going to achieve that next year. I'm in my 50s. I doubt we're going to achieve anything like it, even in my lifetime. So does that mean that I should do nothing? The danger then is that one can be tempted to despair, and despair makes us passive and impotent in the face of the challenges that we face. We need to be thinking in terms of our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren and our great-great-grandchildren. Like the makers, the builders of the great medieval cathedrals, who on the first day of laying the foundations knew they would never live to worship in those cathedrals and yet thought they were worth building. We need to be thinking in those terms. The youth worker of today, praise God, may see fruit for his or her work among the young people she works with, but may not. But that doesn't mean that the work isn't worth doing. Think of the second thief on the cross. Even he acknowledges he deserves to die on the cross, and yet he knows that God is holy. He knows that Jesus is dying a death that is different to the one that he is dying. He knows that he's a sinner, and he knows, most amazingly of all, that Christ's death is going to be the entryway into the kingdom. The religious rulers, the soldiers, they're mocking Christ, saying, if you're the king of the Jews, come down from the cross. The second thief understands that Christ's death is his entryway into heaven. Raises the question, where does he learn this stuff? He doesn't learn it on the cross. God could have beamed it into his brain, but the text doesn't tell us that. I think he was taught it as a kid. It was of no relevance to him at all throughout his life. Even he says he deserves to die. It was of no relevance to him until the moment when it was the only relevant thing to him. And I think that that's how pastors, preachers, youth leaders, youth workers, ordinary Christians need to think. That we do the right thing, we do it graciously and humbly, knowing that our graciousness and our humility may not be recognized by those we're speaking to. And we do it knowing that we may never see the fruit, but knowing that the Lord has promised that there will be fruit. In terms of words of encouragement, the times are dark, but they are not as dark as they have been for many Christians throughout the centuries. Christians being subjected to empire-wide persecution in the 3rd century, for example. Christians operating in Stalin's Russia or behind the Iron Curtain. Christians in China today or North Korea. We in the West, for all of the darkness of our times, there are still encouragements for us. We still have freedom to worship at this point. We still have relatively comfortable lives compared to many Christians throughout the centuries. So first of all, we mustn't despair too much. We should lament what's going on, but we should also acknowledge the Lord has given us many good things at this particular point in time. Secondly, we should remember that the promises hold good. promise to the church, there will be a marriage feast of the Lamb. The bride will be given to the bridegroom at the end of time. That's not a promise to any particular denomination or parachurch organization or nation. My denomination could disappear, but the church will continue to the end of time. The church cannot be destroyed. So we should rejoice in the fact that we know how the story ends, even as we're caught in the midst of the struggle and the fight. Thirdly, I think we should be grateful for the immense privilege we have. We live in dark times, yes, and we have been given the privilege of carrying the torch of truth for the next generation. That can be a thankless task. That can be a hard task, but it's a glorious task. That, if you like, humanly speaking, the continuation of the gospel in these dark times has been given to us. We should rejoice in that. We should be thankful for that, and we should pray that the Lord equips us for that task. When it comes to the cultural battles we're facing, which we're not simply fighting, I think, for the church, we're also fighting to make the world a safe place for children. I really do believe that co-belligerence on things like the LGBTQ issue is important, because we're not just fighting for the gospel. We're also fighting for a world where it's safe to be a kid. Now, I'm acutely aware that the forces ranged against me and people like me far outnumber me and are far better funded than I am and have access to levers of power in our culture which I could never get my hands on. So the question comes, why bother? Well, I bother because I want my granddaughter to grow up in a world that's worth growing up in. And I think of Theoden. I know it's a cliche to think of Tolkien in Christian settings, but I think of that point in The Lord of the Rings where Theoden turns to his attendants who are saying to him, it's hopeless, we're going to lose, and says, yes, we're going to lose, but I will still meet them on the field of battle. We should refuse to concede any ground cheaply. We need to fight for every inch at this point, for the sake of our children and our grandchildren. We may fail, humanly speaking. We may be destroyed in the fight, but it is a fight that is worth fighting. It's a moral imperative, I think, to do that.